I don't think Michael's going to be here, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call the workshop to order and turn it over to you, David.
Thank you. I think we're ready to proceed. Just want to make a short introduction. This is a workshop to discuss changes and the process for our revisions to our land development ordinances. We have employed the services of a consultant, White and Smith Planning, on this project, and we have two representatives that will be presenting virtually tonight, Mr. Tyson Smith and Ms. Kelly Casino. So primarily going to focus on their assessment of our current code and some direction on how we can move forward. So I'm assuming Mr. Smith or Ms. Casino can hear me, so we'll just turn it over to you at this time.
Okay, very good, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for letting us join you tonight this way. We're going to go over, as David said, our assessment of the subdivision and zoning code. This is a document that was completed in March. It's been up on the website. This is a meeting we had hoped to complete at the end of March, but due to the COVID situation, I've had to delay it. So I'm going to share my screen here. What we'll do tonight is go over the project schedule that we probably talked about initially when we were there in December, and then also what we've done so far. And then Kelly is going to go through the assessment with you. She's the primary drafter of that document. If there are thoughts that you have after tonight, feel free to pass them along to Jonathan. He'll make sure that they make their way to us. It's a heck of a lot of material, but we wanted to make sure we at least skimmed across the top of most of the issues tonight so you're aware of the big things anyway. This is a 23-month project. It started in October roughly, or November, I suppose, once we got underway. And the virus is not going to slow us down much. We've got what seems like now a 3-month delay, but we're going to try to stick to no more than a month shift in the project schedule. So we'll look at that here in a second. It's basically made up of three tasks: project initiation, and then this component, which is assessment, what we're actually going to start attacking and drafting, and then we take that up in task 3. You can see here graphically a little bit better where we are, where things stand. We'll go through the drafting process starting in the September timeframe, following development of an outline that will cover both the land development regulations or subdivision codes and the zoning codes in 4 different modules. So I'll go over that, those areas here in a little bit more detail here in a moment. To bring us back to where we saw you last, in December, we spent 2 days with staff and with stakeholders conducting listening sessions. We met with you in the we met with you in the Planning Commission rather, and also with the Zoning Board of Adjustment when we were there. Vaughn Hansen's with us tonight. Vaughn is with a company out of Charlotte called Benchmark Planning, and they're a frequent partner of our team. Vaughn was there for those meetings as well as Kelly and I. So that's the last time you saw us. That was when we had a chance to hear from members in the development community, the real estate community, other planners in the region, et cetera. I just want to point out that I'll remind you that we have a website that Vaughn has constructed for us. That's the project website, and it will be a go-to resource for what is happening, what happens next, and for our documents. And the document you're considering tonight, or that we're going over rather, is up on that website as well. Also a Facebook page there. This meeting, like the Planning Commission meeting we had in June to go over the same thing with them that we're going over with you tonight, is posted on YouTube. Both are recorded, and both are accessible from the website or from the Facebook page. So those are there, and that sort of thing will be tracked throughout the project. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly here in a second. The goals of the project, just if we step back and look at the overarching level, obviously to implement some of the key policies from York Ford, which was adopted in 2016. Codes like this one, they've been used for many years. You had a couple of updates in the 2000-2002 timeframe, which now is a pretty decent time ago. And Language can be outdated. There can be conflicts that occur as amendments are made to the document. So what we're trying to do is modernize those standards, create flexibility where we can, create predictability where we need to, and then most importantly, let's make what's desirable in your community easy to do. So removing any regulatory obstacles or procedural obstacles that are redundant or unnecessary to get accomplished what you want to get accomplished. So that's key there, and there are a ton of substantive issues that we have heard that we need to address, and Kelly's going to spend more time on those, and I'm going to stop screen sharing and let her get started. Are there any questions so far about what I've covered? I've asked Kelly to pause after every 4 or 5 slides and give you an opportunity to ask questions as we go, since there is so much material. So feel free to just speak, and there are few enough of us here now that if you just speak and interject, we'll stop and have a discussion about anything you have a question about. Okay, Kelly.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm going to take you all through the public review draft of the Zoning and Subdivision Codes assessment. There's 5 sections, including detailed reviews of the Zoning and Subdivision Codes in sections 3 and 4, as well as specific recommendations for revision. Those recommendations are based off of the feedback that we received in the kickoff sessions that Tyson mentioned a second ago, as well as our own review of the codes. There are 7 development-related chapters in a county code under Title 15, which is land usage, but the focus for this project is chapters 154 and 155, the zoning and subdivision codes. There may be some ancillary revisions to some of the other sections of Title 15, just for consistency with any changes in the zoning and subdivision codes. So as Tyson mentioned, it's been a while since the zoning and subdivision codes were last updated. There have been targeted amendments to various sections of the codes over the years, but no comprehensive update in about 20 years or so. During that time, as you all are well aware, York County has experienced significant growth. The real estate market has changed, technology has changed, and the existing codes are outdated and do not promote the desired development patterns in the county. So moving into the text of the assessment, we'll start with a review of the zoning code. I'm specifically going to focus on the more substantive recommendations in sections 3 and 4 of the assessment. The review of the current zoning code is divided into the 6 major topics that are listed here. There are recommendations and alternatives discussed within the text of each section, and they're also summarized at the end in a text box like the one shown here. So we'll start with zoning code structure, formatting, and usability. Consistent with the rest of the York County Code of Ordinances, the zoning code is divided into unnumbered subchapters and numbered sections. While this functions effectively for other shorter chapters of the county code, it really limits the ability to organize the zoning code in a user-friendly format, just due to the length and complexity of the zoning code. An additional level of numbered organization between subchapter and section would be useful. Next, readers expect to find a glossary at the end of a document, so we recommend consolidating all of the definitions into a single subchapter at the end of the zoning code, and then augmenting, revising, and modernizing those definitions as needed. The zoning code already includes the use table, which is a best practice. We recommend maintaining and updating the table and removing the use lists from the zoning districts. This ties into another recommendation to consolidate use-specific regulations into a single code section, which we'll discuss a bit later in the presentation. And then, since they're generally unrelated to zoning, we recommend removing the tax districts from the zoning code and relocating them to an existing or new chapter in the County Code of Ordinances. There are a number of ways to improve the user friendliness and readability of the codes. One is to illustrate dimensional standards and design elements wherever possible, and including those graphics in line with their associated standards rather than in an appendix. And also presenting information, especially quantitative, dimensional, and development standards in a table format where possible. This illustration here on the right is from a code that we're working on in Texas, where you can see a table for dimensional standards for a particular zoning district, as well as a graphic that illustrates those standards. We recommend removing the notes that are embedded within the codes and instead maintaining those as code section cross-references. They often repeat standards that are found in other sections of the code, which leaves room for inconsistencies when other code sections are updated. The county could consider including commentaries throughout the code to help explain regulations that could be set off, with a different formatting or text. And then consider distinguishing defined terms within the text of the code through bold fonts or other text attributes, which signals to the reader that they should consult the definition section for more information. Moving into the zoning districts, this section of the assessment reviews the 16 base zoning districts as well as the 8 overlay districts. This particular graphic illustrates the land area in York County by zoning district. So this is base districts only and does not include overlay districts. Approximately 19% of the land in York County is incorporated into a municipality, and 81% of the land is unincorporated and subject to the York County zoning code. And that 81% is what's shown in the graphic here. Overall, York County has a sufficient number of base zoning districts for a county of its size and regional context. However, nearly 80% of the land in unincorporated York County is located in just 3 zoning districts, AGC, RUD, and RC1. The 5 least used zoning districts, which are shown here kind of in the bottom right of the graphic. Those are BD 1, 2, and 3, as well as LI and TND. All of those together comprise less than 1.4% of the unincorporated land area. The limited use of the business development districts may be due to the fact that most commercial and business development is occurring in eastern York County, where annexation into municipalities is often required for water sewer service. Nonetheless, their limited use provides an opportunity to rethink these districts and better align them with the different levels of development, use, and intensity that stakeholders want to see in zoning districts. And in fact, that's one of the recommendations in this section of the assessment, is to rethink the uses and development standards in the BD districts. A few other recommendations related to the zoning districts. One is to rename the residential districts to reflect lot size or density. It's not clear from the district names what the purpose is of the districts, and we think that could be better reflected through the district names. As I just mentioned, structure the business and industrial districts based on intensity, like light, medium, and heavy. The county could explore implementation of the I-77 corridor specific transitional standards through zoning code development standards. Recommendation to revise or eliminate the UD district, which has been an ongoing conversation in York County, and revise the PD district. And then we had recommendations to create several new districts. Business and Technology Park is an example of a recommendation from the I-77 plan that could be implemented. And then consider adding a new high-density multifamily residential district, and reconsider the zoning districts in which townhouses, duplexes, garden apartments, sort of smaller multifamily uses are permitted. And then with respect to some of the overlay districts, the arterial roads overlay and the Lake Wylie and Catawba River buffers overlay, their provisions are largely development standards that could be incorporated with similar provisions in other sections of the code, rather than having a separate overlay zoning district for those. We also heard from the Board of Zoning Appeals that they see a lot of variance requests for sign standards in the Lake Wylie overlay. So we'd recommend taking a look at those standards in conjunction with the rest of the sign ordinance and again, potentially incorporating those Lake Wiley specific standards into the general sign ordinance. These other overlay zoning districts have clear policy value, but they need updating or streamlining. For example, the abandoned cemeteries overlay doesn't have any standards. So we recommend either adding standards or consider eliminating the overlay altogether. And instead, the county could consider incorporating standards for protection of abandoned cemeteries into other sections of the zoning code so that they would apply throughout the county, again, without the need to have a separate overlay zoning district. And with that, I'll pause and ask if anybody has any questions. Nope. Okay. I will move on to uses and use regulations. So this is a detailed review of specific uses in the code, principal uses, accessory uses, temporary, and the like. This text box on the screen lists a number of uses that either aren't addressed in the current code or aren't well addressed in the current code. So these are specific uses that we'll look at during the code update along with others. As I mentioned earlier, we recommend maintaining the use table, updating it and modernizing it, and actually moving it a little bit farther down in the code than it currently appears. And then adding provisions that would allow the zoning administrator to determine whether and how unlisted uses are allowed. This would have specific criteria and potentially reference sources that the zoning administrator could use to make that determination. Of course, with the decision being appealable to the Board of Zoning Appeals like other administrative decisions. This sample use table that's on the screen is an excerpt from Rock Hill's code where they have actually color-coded the use table to match the colors on the zoning map, which just improves the user friendliness of the code. So this graphic displays the number of uses that are allowed in each of the zoning districts. The principal uses are in the darker green and the accessory uses are in the lighter blue colored. Including by right and special exception uses, there are an average of 23 allowed principal uses and 10 accessory uses in each of the agricultural and residential districts, and an average of 78 allowed principal uses and 4 accessory uses in the business and industrial districts. Stakeholders had a concern with the sheer number of uses that are allowed in the UD district and the potential incompatibilities that result from such a permissive use list. And you can see from this graphic that the UD district allows considerably more uses than the other zoning districts. And then stakeholders found the listed uses both too broad and too specific. So in general, the uses should be modernized and better defined. There are 213 individually listed uses, which appears to be a long list, but the use regulations really don't reflect the broad range of contemporary uses that are likely to occur in the community. I mentioned this a minute ago about consolidating use-specific regulations into a single subchapter. So these would be regulations that apply to specific uses like accessory dwelling units or breweries, and just getting those all into one place. These type of regulations can apply whether a use is permitted by right or has to go through a discretionary approval process like a special exception. And if it's a use permitted by right, compliance with the any use specific regulations would be verified during the required zoning compliance review. And I'll pause there and see if there are any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I'll move into development standards, which is a review of all these different elements, landscaping, parking, open space, signs, and so forth. So in general, we recommend reviewing and update all of the development standards, but particularly those that are subject to frequent variance requests, which we've listed here in the text box on the right. When you see a lot of variance requests for a particular topic, that can point to an issue with the regulations and perhaps they're not working quite the way they were intended. We also recommend reviewing and updating the lot dimensional standards. This is an, lot area, width, depth, as well as setbacks. We recommend eliminating the county-wide height limit and instead regulating height by district and or by land use. This is another place where those use-specific regulations section can come in handy if there's a specific use that warrants a taller building height regardless of the district. That could be accommodated in the use regulations. We'd also recommend establishing maximum impervious surface ratios for each zoning district. This can help control the bulk and sort of character of development, but it also affects the rate and volume of stormwater runoff. And then consider establishing a maximum floor area ratio in the zoning districts. And this is another way to control development intensity and bulk. And often floor area ratio is used in non-residential districts, though it can be used in residential districts as well. Review and update the buffer yard standards, providing flexible and context-specific standards. And then, as I mentioned before, there are some other buffer-related regulations throughout the code that could be consolidated here. We heard that the tree conservation subchapter needs complete revision, including a review of any provisions related to mass grading or clear cutting. We recommend clarifying and simplifying the open space standards, modernizing the parking regulations, thorough review and modernization of the sign regulations to make sure that they are up to date with current case law as well as industry standards, and then review and update the commercial design standards. And again, I'll pause there to see if there are any questions on the development standards. Okay, nonconformities. In this section, we'd recommend adding a purpose statement to clarify the intent of the regulations, just so that property owners understand why there are these limitations on nonconforming uses. The code also should address the full range of nonconforming situations, so not just nonconforming lots, uses, or buildings, but also site improvements like parking or landscaping. And along those lines, to add thresholds for when a change in use triggers an upgrade of non-conforming site improvements. For example, if the use changes, when do they have to come into compliance with the current parking requirements? Procedures and administration. I'll talk about this table in a little more detail in the next couple of slides, but this section of the assessment just reviews the current approval and development procedures and processes, and then makes some recommendations for new procedures. We'd recommend consolidating all of the zoning related procedures into a single subchapter and including a summary table like this one from Charleston County. This helps readers and applicants get a good sort of at a glance view of what's required for a particular application. Any lists of submittal requirements, application requirements, we'd recommend maintaining those as checklists outside the code. One, they significantly add to the length of the ordinance, and two, maintaining them outside of the code allows staff to update the list as needed without having to go through a formal ordinance amendment process. We'd also recommend standardizing each procedure into a common workflow. So for example, every procedure, whether it's a variance or a rezoning, would have these 11 or so subheadings that just provide for consistency between the different types of procedures. We can also look at adding flowcharts for different applications, which again helps with user friendliness. So there are a number of procedures in the current code. For the most part, we recommend maintaining those, but then adding a few other new procedures. The first would be to consider a major and minor zoning compliance process. So that would help streamline the process. The traffic impact analysis procedure already operates under a similar major minor review process. So this would kind of fold right into that. Under this scenario, major site plans would require a higher level of review than minor site plans due to their size, location, anticipated traffic generation, or other development characteristics. The code currently doesn't specify how to amend the comprehensive plan or future land use map. This is specified in the state law, but it's also good to codify it in the local code. We also recommend adding a procedure for administrative interpretations. Now, this would allow an applicant to get a formal interpretation from the zoning administrator. Again, that's appealable to the Board of Zoning Appeals, just like any other administrative decision or interpretation. We also recommend the county look at allowing for administrative variances or administrative adjustments for development standards such as setbacks, parking, lot width, buffer yards, that sort of thing. These would allow the zoning administrator to approve limited adjustments to quantitative development standards based on clear criteria, for example, up to a 10% reduction in setbacks. And then the zoning administrator would have the ability to send more complex cases to the Board of Zoning Appeals, again, also according to clear criteria. And we would note here that the South Carolina Planning Act is not explicit in terms of this authority outside of the plan development context. Therefore, we would definitely coordinate with the county attorney on any procedures related to administrative adjustments. And also consider allowing concurrent approval processes where possible. I know there are some jurisdictions in the region that allow, for example, an applicant to seek rezoning and special exception approval concurrently. So this is something we can look at as well to see where it might make sense. And I'll stop there before I get into the subdivision code to see if there are any questions. Okay. The review of the current subdivision code follows the same format as the previous section of the zoning code. There are 6 sort of general topics with recommendations in each section, and then summarized again at the end of each section. A lot of the formatting recommendations for that we have for the zoning code also hold for the subdivision code. In addition, we would recommend renaming this as Land Development Code or Land Development Regulations, just to better reflect that this is, the regulations are a lot more than just subdivision of land. We'd recommend reorganizing the subdivision code, consolidating related regulations, updating any engineering standards or standard details and specifications, and actually relocating them to a separate land development manual that's maintained outside of the code. A lot of these are industry standards, engineering standards that either don't change very often or that really just don't need to be taking up space in the county code. We recommend adding an introductory section and cross-reference other relevant county code sections like stormwater, and then any manuals that are maintained outside the code like that, like land development manual. And then any technical requirements related to land development that are currently in the zoning code, we would recommend moving those to the new or the revised subdivision code, land development code. For example, driveways and curb cuts are really more of a land development issue than a zoning issue. And then conversely, relocate any common open space standards to the zoning code. In terms of subdivision layout and lot configuration, we'd recommend the county look at street design standards based on street classification, arterial, local, collector, that sort of thing. Consider requiring curbs, sidewalk, and turn lanes for developments that meet certain thresholds. This folds into that traffic impact analysis process as well. Clarify the purpose of interconnectivity requirements, and just strengthen the language to make sure that interconnectivity is provided where possible. And let me pause there and ask if there are any questions. Okay, moving into the design standards. Again, relocating some of the more technical construction standards to that separate land development manual. Anything related to storm drainage needs to be removed and just cross-reference Chapter 152 of the code, since that was updated recently. look at specifying sidewalk requirements by zoning district for local residential streets, and then also look at low impact development site design techniques that helps with stormwater and aesthetics. Required subdivision improvements, recommend a cross-reference to chapter 51, which I believe is the sewer, water and sewers section, just to make sure that folks have a clear understanding of the county's policy on sewer extension. Consider a mandatory water and sewer connection requirement for non-residential properties that are within a certain distance of an existing line. And then removing the sediment and erosion control subchapter and cross-referencing chapter 152 again, since that was updated most recently and would help reduce redundancies in the code. And finally, procedures and administration in the subdivision. This section of the assessment reviews these various land development related procedures. Again, the same organization and formatting recommendations as with the zoning code. For example, that streamlined workflow with 10 or 11 common headings. So that would be the same provide some consistency between the zoning code and subdivision code. Consider requiring pre-application meetings for major subdivisions. This can help identify issues or concerns early on, make sure that subdividers are addressing what needs to be addressed. And then finally, expanding the provisions for administrative approval of minor changes to preliminary plats, again, in consultation with the county attorney to make sure that everything is consistent with the State Planning Act. And then before I turn it back to Tyson, I'm happy to answer any questions.
So how do we know who the stakeholders are and what, in other words, I think there are a lot of people who would like to be stakeholders who aren't considered stakeholders. So how do we include people that are interested and we are sure that we are covering all of our bases within each district?
Sure, I'll jump in here. We can, in fact, maybe while we're here, pull up the list of stakeholders we sat down with in December. Then there'll be open, publicly advertised opportunities for the public or anybody else to come speak as we go through each module. So that will be 4 individual modules where if you haven't been specially invited, you're welcome to come in. And then, of course, there'll be the adoption process itself. But if you feel like, or anybody on the council feels like we haven't spoken to the right, group or section of York County, let us know what that is, and we're happy to set up a Zoom call with them or a phone call with them and talk to them now. So
I don't think you have to show us now who you talk to, but I'd like to have that information sometime this week, just so we're aware of. I think by district, we'd like to know who our stakeholders are.
Okay, good. We'll forward that or coordinate with Jonathan to get you that list.
Okay, thank you.
And I just have a comment more than a question. As most of the people sitting out there in TV land and watching us have probably figured out, this is a complicated discussion and a complicated problem we have. And ever since I've been on council, I've said that I felt like our zoning code was way too cumbersome and too complicated. Even sometimes when we talk to the planning staff, and they've been, we've got wonderful staff on planning, but sometimes it's hard for them to figure out exactly what the code means and what it says. So I'm glad to hear a lot of the things you're talking about. I know this is very high level, so I didn't have a lot of detailed questions, but I'm glad to hear, the recommendations for the color-coded charts of what's available for each zone, that type thing. Because that's one of the big things I get is constituents calling me, and that in the workflow, the charts for that, because I get people calling me and they're like, I want to do this, but I don't even know where to start. I don't know what I need. I don't know what the process is, or if I do turn in this one application, I don't know what's next. And staff tells them a lot of that, but a lot of people are planners, and they like to be able to get their ducks in a row and kind of know what's going on before they go to staff and say, okay, now this is the next step, and then they go back and do that and come back again. So I'm glad to see that a lot of that's being implemented in your recommendations.
Yeah, I think I always used to say we facilitate, I heard mention flow charts, simplifying, and that's what I like about it. Especially if there's flow charts, staff can just hand them. We don't need to have where they're doing all the things they're supposed to do, come back, and then they're given another list of things to do. So, anything we can do to simplify and be user-friendly to help out the taxpayers, I'm all for.
You got this?
Anybody else? David, any comments? Well, I guess we're done. Anything y'all need to add to it for us?
Well, I'll just point out what you can expect to happen at this point. We will move from this point and make any final revisions to the assessment and finalize that in the document. And that will be basically what guides us through the process. So if you're wondering if we're going to cover something, or if one of your constituents comes to you and says, we need to address something, you can direct them, or you can look yourself at the assessment to see if maybe it's already on the list, so to speak. But if not, we'll fold that in as we go. The next step then is to develop an annotated outline, which is an outline of the new code, which has the LDRs and the zoning code sections combined. We'll just review that with staff to make sure we're going the way they want us to go, and then we'll just start drafting. And our objective, or our hope, is that you'll have module 1 to look at in November. And Ms. Love, this is what I was referencing, where there'll be a staff review draft, and then based on their input, we'll have a public review draft to present to the public and to the council and to the planning commission as well, most likely in the December timeframe. So, Kelly, you can advance it, and I think that's going to take us to our contact slide. So if you do have thoughts, always available to set up a call. But just for workflow purposes, if you'll get those at least initially to Jonathan and let him vet those and get them to us, we'd appreciate that. We'll get them to the right person on the team to address. With that, we are finished. And thanks again for letting us meet with you this way tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Jonathan, anything
Thank you.
to add? All right. Is there executive session? No executive session. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned from the workshop. We will start council meeting at 6 o'clock.